again on all of the worm bins, and I'm starting with my recently restarted regular totes. With the regular totes, just to go over again, I don't have any holes at the bottom of the bins. I don't double bin. I just have a single bin, and for the moisture content, I either put the lid on, which has its own vent, or I vent it through mosquito screen. So I just recently set this bin up again after harvesting out the finished castings. So there is a lot of cardboard, a lot of larger material still in the bin. What I'm noticing as the summer is progressing here in New Jersey is that these bins are holding onto a lot more moisture, which is typical considering that I have a lot of humidity in the air right now. So for the summer with these bins, which tend to run muddier and wetter than my other bins, I want to focus on not putting too much moisture into these bins and trying to maintain the health of the worms. So since they were restarted and they do have a lot of material still in them, I'm going to give it a smaller feeding. There were still some banana peels where the worms were hanging out in, so I put those peels back in, gave it some of a watermelon, which may or may not be a good thing to do considering the watermelon and its rind do hold a lot of water, but we'll see what happens next week. And then this bin was set up for another week. Regular tote that I have, I'm noticing that with restarting these bins, the top layer, just a thin layer, looks like it's drying out really well, but when you dig underneath, all the moisture is being held under. So I find it's really important with my totes to make sure that I reach all the way down to the bottom, pull the material up and mix it all together. That way I don't have any large clumps that are more wet than the other part of it. Now that I've gotten a couple of weeks in from harvest, you can definitely see where the worms are starting to work. The top layer of the side where they are has the newer castings that the worms have created. So they're definitely moving from side to side, which is great. I don't find any large worm balls right now, but here's one in a banana peel where they're enjoying some of the banana. I do like to give them bananas as they hang out in the bin for a couple of weeks and provide a good food source for the worms, where I'm not too concerned if I needed to extend when I feed them because the peels stay around for so long. I also noticed with this bin that it is still staying a little wetter than its sister bin, and I'm not sure if that's just the worm colony that's in here, how they operate, but it's still interesting that they were restarted the same, given the same material, but still continue to exhibit different types of environments that the worms create. So with this bin, just like the other bin, I'm giving it a smaller feeding than I would normally give of the watermelon, hoping that the watermelon doesn't contribute too much to increasing the moisture content, and then just giving the grit, and it also will be set up for another week. The next bin is the first of my Vermibag totes. Now the Vermibag totes, unlike the regular bins, tend to dry out a lot faster than regular totes. So with this one, I more so look to keep the moisture content a little higher than with keeping it lower in the regular totes. But with that said, even this summer with the high humidity we've had, this bin has been running a lot wetter than it's normally been. For this bin, it was recently restarted just a couple weeks before the regular tote bins. It was restarted, and around the time that I finished harvesting the regular totes, I added more material to these bins. So this bin has a lot of cardboard in it, and that's what I said I was going to focus on with my bins, was making sure that when I harvested, I had a good size harvest of castings. So in this bin, the worms are moving around, no large clumps of worms either, as it just recently restarted and they have a lot of material to spread out through a lot of food sources with the cardboard. But in this one, I'm going to give it a larger feeding than I gave in the regular totes, as the moisture is going to evaporate all around the sides. This bin does not touch the sides of the tote that it's inside of, so it does have a lot of good airflow around it, which allows for the moisture to evaporate quicker out of these. But after giving it some banana and watermelon, this one was also set up for the next week. With the second Vermibag tote, I am mid-harvest with this one. So I have the castings that were finished in a proofing tray for pizza with a bait tray inside of it. Now when I removed the bait tray, what I first noticed is that the bait tray felt very light. Even though I had put food in it, I could tell that there weren't a lot of worms. So what I'm doing is trying to go through the finished castings to see if I see a lot of worms. And unfortunately I don't, and I'm kind of confused by this, because the bin right before harvest, there were worms in there. There was a good colony, so it's confusing as to why I don't see worms in the castings and none are in the bait tray. Additionally, where I keep my bin during the harvest, I don't see any dried worms around the edges where it's evidence of a mass evacuation. So I'm a little confused, but I'm still going to put some material inside of the bait tray itself again for another week to see. Inside of the tote itself, I'm mixing the material I put in there the previous week. That's the base. While I'm harvesting, I don't add food or additional material until after everything. But once I dump this out, I did notice there weren't a ton of worms. There are some, but for the first week of a harvest, there definitely wasn't enough. So again, I haven't any clue as to what happened with these worms. But I think what I'll do is, once I do another week of baiting out, I'm going to just harvest worms from other bins to put in here, as I know the other bins do have larger colonies. But it's just weird having another instance of where the worms look fine one week and then the next week all of a sudden something's going on. And the last time that this happened to me, it occurred because I let the bin dry out too much. But the castings that I have that are finished from this tote weren't dry, and as I mentioned, the week before I went to harvest, I had a lot of worms. So it's just one of those things that I guess can happen. It always makes me sad because I don't want to think that I'm doing something wrong and hurting the worms, but I'm definitely unsure. So once I finish putting the grit in with the tote itself and left the food in there in the restarted bin, I'm going to add some more food to the bait tray with the grit and cover it up with some of the castings and let it go for another week. I hope to find some more worms in these castings. Worst case, what I'll do is delay using these castings and sifting them to give time for any cocoons or juvenile worms the necessary time that they need to get larger so I can see them. There's also the option of getting a finer strainer for my castings to see if I can collect any cocoons or juvenile worms to put back in. But at this point, I'm just baffled as to what happened. The last and final bin is my Vermibag Mini. It is my one and only flow-through system, and I do definitely enjoy having a system like this because it can handle a lot of food, handle a lot of moisture, and I don't get a lot of leachate out of the bottom or find that the castings get too muddy. If anything, the castings are more dry than anything, so I am surprised by the fact that inside of the castings, right under that first layer, that the castings are wetter than normal. Around the edges, of course not, because it is still that same material like the Vermi bag totes, so there's a lot of air circulation, a lot of surface area where the water can evaporate from. But in the middle of this bag, it is much wetter than I am accustomed to, which is not a bad thing. The worms seem to enjoy it, and they're still nice and healthy in there. So with this one, I am trying to bring the level of the castings up while also not getting the castings too dry. So I do add a lot more water to this bin than I do any of my other bins, and that's because there's much more material to it. So this week what I decided to do was not add a layer underneath with the cardboard. I'm going to just give the feeding to this bin, then put the additional cardboard on top, and then water down everything one more time. In this bin, I do tend to put a heavier feeding in there, and when I go back the following week, most of the time there's not a lot of food unless it's something that hangs around for a long time, like the banana peels. So I did give it quite a bit of watermelon, which also has a higher water content as we've discussed, and added the grit as usual to this before adding the cardboard layer in. I'm thinking that somewhere around the end of July, beginning of August, I'm going to harvest this bin again by itself. But once completing the addition of the cardboard and some more water, this bin is set up for another week. That concludes the update for this week. As always, thank you for sticking to the end. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this content, and thanks for watching.